Hogan have put together some slides for me to present to you today about their Global Leadership Effectiveness Study. And the reason for getting involved in any of this is that obviously leadership is a massively important, influential, consequential matter. It impacts massively on the people within an organisation and it impacts on the organisation itself, of course. So Hogan have put together a few reference points here in terms of leadership research that's pertinent, in terms of thinking about the impact that leadership has. So some studies there that would say that have a bit of a range there in terms of how much variation of company performance the CEO accounts for. But studies have shown that maybe that ranges between 17 to 30%. But leaders it isn't just about CEOs. Effective leaders can double an organisation's profits, was a study recounted in Forbes. And then, there's lots of studies that show kind of more granular detail with leadership performance directly impacting measures such as organisational effectiveness, financial performance, innovation, and of course, many more outcomes. But Hogan are always interested in this difference between leadership emergence and leadership effectiveness. In fact, it underpins to some extent their high potential model as well. So just to sort of set up the research structure, we're going to present the findings then from a study that compares at the global level and also at the UK level who is leading. So more the emergent leaders, the ones who've made it, who are actually in positions of leadership, versus who we want to lead us, who should lead. And just to remind ourselves in terms of what is the definition then of an emergent leader. So Hogan's point of view on this would be that emergent leaders are the ones, they've made it. They are in those positions of power, but for a lot of them, they're in those positions of leadership because they've been good at climbing the greasy pole. And in many organisations, that can be because they are political animals, because they've been good at that. They've got on with the people they need to. They've impressed the people that they need to. But are they necessarily effective as leaders? Some of them will be, of course. I'm not saying that. But some of them won't be. Some of them are good at the impressing part and not the actual heart of the matter, actually being an effective leader. And when it comes to the data we've got on leaders, Hogan have had a look actually just recently and done quite a few country comparisons. And what they can say is that there are differences between different countries in terms of the personality characteristics that help emergent leaders get into those leadership positions. So these are some recent blogs that are on their website and some of the countries that they've compared. So just to pick out, so in Japan, for instance, the emergent leaders tend to be lower on ambition, lower on learning approach. This is lower compared to the global exec sample. Higher on cautious on the HDS in Japan and lower on power and lower on recognition. So I guess that probably plays into some of our stereotypes of what we think is going to make a successful leader within the Japanese culture. And I say that as somebody who knows a tiny, tiny amount. There's probably people here who know a lot more about that than I do. But then you can see, the results are very different for Brazil and for Hungary. There are different aspects of personality and values that are more critical for leaders to be emergent leaders. They've got to those positions of power in those different countries. So we can see that, yes, emergent leaders vary by country in terms of their personality characteristics. But we don't yet know if those leaders who would be described as effective, would those characteristics that effective leaders have, would that vary by country? We don't know that yet. And that is the purpose of this study, of the Global Leader Effectiveness Study. So effective leaders then, in the Hogan terminology, would be defined as those who can build and maintain high-performing teams. It's all about a collective effort. It's all about focusing on supporting their teams to succeed, rather than a leader just kind of glorying in their own position of power and enjoying that. Hogan argued that leadership should be a resource for the followers, not just a position of privilege for the individual. So this study is going to look at, okay, so we know emergent leaders differ in their characteristics by country, but what about effective leaders? And the only way that we can do that is to ask at the moment, is to ask people what they want from their leaders. So I thought it might be helpful for those of you who maybe didn't participate in the GLES to see, well, what was the survey all about? What was the structure of it? So there was one section which had competency questions. So you were asked to rate the extent to which each competency is necessary to be an ideal leader. So you're picturing your ideal leader. And in that, you're saying, is this competency, say, for instance, here of accountability? Is it something that's extremely important for being an ideal leader, all the way down through to not important at all? So Hogan have 62 competencies in their Hogan competency model. So each of those competencies is in that survey, and people would have rated each of those. And then section 2 was personality questions, which will tap into and align with the scales across all 3 of the Hogan instruments. But here we just got an example, 2 examples. So here you had to rate the impact to ideal leader performance if an individual, for example, is concerned about the welfare of others. So that's probably tapping into altruism on MVPI. And you say whether you think that's very bad through to very good for job performance. Or similarly, please rate the impact to ideal leader performance if an individual enjoys solving problems, and so on. So those were the kinds of questions that survey respondents were given. And I'm going to quickly run through the global findings before we move on to the UK-specific findings. So here we have on the right-hand side the leaders we want. What did survey respondents, and the total number of survey respondents was just over 8,000. So at the global level, accumulating all of that data across all of the countries that participated, the leaders we want are 68% of respondents say they want them to be higher on ambition. They want to be competitive and driven. 66% want them to be diplomatic, warm, friendly, sensitive, high on interpersonal sensitivity. And 59% of respondents wanted them to be more innovative, more curious, more forward-thinking, relating to high inquisitive. Sorry, I should have said these are the bright side results first. We're just focusing on HPI here. Sorry, I forgot to preface that. So that's what we want, but what about what we have? So what Hogan then did was they looked at their most recent norm data, which is from 2023, which is a representative sample. And from that representative sample, pull out those who are at the executive level. So it's all stratified for gender, age, ethnicity, and so on. But these are just the execs, so that's why it's just 21,000. So these are the people who are being described as at the executive level. And when they look at their database of data, they find actually it's a pretty good match. That on average, they do tend to score higher ambition and a bit higher on interpersonal sensitivity and a bit higher on inquisitive. So at the bright side level, there's a fair degree of overlap in terms of what we want globally and what we have. When we look at the dark side, people are being asked here in terms of what they want, they're sort of being asked what they don't want. So they're identifying the derailers that would have a negative impact on ideal leader performance. So what they're saying is 72%, so it's a pretty high level of respondents are saying they don't want their leaders to be high on excitable. 56% don't want them to be high on cautious because they want them to speak up and voice their opinions. And 62% don't want them to be high on leisurely. They want them to be more open and honest about their workflow and discuss with people rather than being passive aggressive and putting stuff to one side. And they also want people who are going to score lower on bold. They would prefer them to be more modest and display some humility. So in terms of the leaders we actually have in the global sample, you can see we get a match for the first 3. So they do, on average, tend to score lower on excitable, cautious, and leisurely. But there's a mismatch on the bold derailer. So the current sample, at least anyway, of global execs tend to score higher on average on bold than their followers would necessarily want them to. Yep.
Are you sending these slides out afterwards?
Yes, we can. Yeah, we usually, yeah, of course, yeah. And then finally with the values. So the first thing to note actually in terms of what people want from their leaders in terms of values, the first thing you'll see there is those response rates are quite a bit lower. They're not, there isn't a 70% of respondents think this value is important. And we'll see that again with the UK data. And I think this makes sense to me. I don't know if any of you came to our 25 years of Hogan event, but at that I presented some archival data and looked at differences across the three instruments in terms of different sectors, comparing public versus private, and also some specific industry sectors. And I always found the biggest differences across sectors was on values. So, for instance, food and beverage were high on hedonism, healthcare were high on science. So the context that we're in, to some extent, is going to impact the values that we want and that are important to us. So it makes sense to me that there isn't going to be one really strong value as much as there is around the personality characteristics. I think it is more context specific. But having said all of that, in terms of what were the highest rated values, generally, they were around being positive around teamwork and belonging, displaying high affiliation, and also, though, high science. People want their leaders mostly to be fairly logical and data-driven. Yeah.
Just wondering as well whether, I'm not talking about the belonging side, but the teamwork side, whether COVID's had an impact on that, just in terms of what people deem to be important. About actually being with your team,
right?
Actually, more, I guess more siloed working. It's just a thought.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, in terms of whether that's changed sort of before and after. Yeah. Something that we kind of, because maybe people wouldn't have picked it out before because it happened more anyway. Is that what you mean? Whereas now we don't take it so much for granted, but we identify it as more of a specific kind of need, want.
Actually, it was more of an observation because I thought the 48% was lower, and I was thinking maybe that's because how people define teamwork has changed since COVID. It was just an observation.
Right. So they are lower, but these are the two highest. That was the point I was trying to sort of preface the whole values piece with, that we don't see 70 or 80% of respondents choose one particular value. The highest congruence is this 48% of respondents choosing affiliation, followed by the second highest being 46%. Yeah.
Is that a fair takeaway then, your point about context? Someone was saying that effective leadership, you actually, if you come with too strong values, it might be a hindrance, because if you're not in the right context, I work at a place that very high on science, very data driven, for example. If you came in with high affiliation, it might be more of a hindrance with what people need and want, the kind of working environment they're after.
If you have the high science as well, then that could be a bonus, because what you're doing, so there's an argument that maybe at least you want your leader to have some congruence with your values, but you don't have to all be exactly the same. That notion that within an organisation you have some shared purpose, but also some diversity. I know I've mentioned this before, but there's the whole groupthink piece. And if we're all approaching problems in exactly the same way, actually we tend to be less effective at solving the problems than if we bring more diverse perspectives. So it's kind of like almost like a case-by-case basis as to how the values are going to play out. But I think, if you're in an environment where science is really key, if you have a leader for whom that just isn't important, that is going to be a problem. But if they have the science, but they have some other stuff as well, then they can leverage their commonality and bring in the other stuff, the more diverse stuff, that perhaps then makes people be more effective, if that makes sense. So then, in terms of what our leaders are actually like from the data, Then in terms of affiliation, yes, they do tend to score just above the mean, really, on average for the affiliation scale, but in fact lower on science. So there's a bit of a mismatch there between what we want and what we have in terms of that science point on values. And then finally, you remember on the GLES there was a section on competencies. I think this is a really interesting slide. So what they did on the left-hand side was they took the data they had from that global exec sample and they ran it through their program called Configure. I don't know if any of you here use Configure, but that takes Hogan personality scales, runs it through various algorithms and spits out a score against the 62 Hogan competencies. You'll see the N there is a bit different to what we said before, and that's just because the current norms are not in the Configure system, so they used a global exec benchmark instead because they had to use the 2019 norms. So it's not a representative sample of global execs because it's not from the norm group, but it is 106,000 of them. So hopefully that goes some way towards mitigating the fact it isn't a representative sample. But nevertheless, when you put that through that platform, what it picks out, what are the top 5 ranked competencies in terms of people, what you've got in your database. You've got people that have got these particular scores across the 3 Hogan instruments. When you rescore that against competencies, what are the top 5 ranked ones? Okay, so it seems that within our global exec sample, they're going to be good at competing with others, inspiring others, presenting to others, taking initiative, and driving innovation and driving strategy. But if we look on the right-hand side and the results from the GLES survey, when people were asked what kind of competencies they thought would actually have an impact on ideal leader performance, then the top 5 that came out from this in terms of what we want are communication, decision-making, accountability, integrity, and leading others. So there is no overlap at all. And I think what you can see is on the left-hand side, those are the emergent leaders. They're the ones who are impressing. They're the shiny, bright people who are doing everything they can to get noticed. Whereas on the right-hand side, that's much more about effective leadership. That's what followers want their leaders to display. Sorry, you had a question.
I'm just curious about the sample of the people who, what they want their executives to exhibit. And I wondered whether there was a split between, say, chairs or investors and people who work for said leaders.
Right. Yeah, no, so we don't have, we don't have that kind of level of data. So yes, we've got 9,000 and odd people have responded to this, but I actually don't have sort of demographic data on the respondents. And mostly it is, the distributors around the globe for Hogan were asked to reach out to their clients to ask them to participate. So it's people who are, they're interested, but I can't describe them in terms of, the different industry sectors or levels or so on. Yeah.
Because, I don't know if it's the same point or different, but I hear it that when I look at on the right side, it's almost like what the team wants.
Yes.
It looks very much like down, up, and on the left, it's what those executives need to show to the board.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So you can, and so it's a really very clear demonstration of that difference between emergent leaders who's made it and what their followers, not the people above them, but what their followers would actually want them to demonstrate. So that is all at the global level. So now I'm going to run through the UK findings, and starting with the bright side. So I'll just do this in slightly more detail than at the global level. So the scales that have been picked out here, they're picked out because they are either sort of above or below the average in the sample, or they specifically relate to the GLES, to characteristics that are wanted, or in fact they're statistically significantly different to the global sample, and I'll explain as we go through. So in terms of what we actually have, so you've got the global exec sample, which is representative, and then they've just picked out the UK people from within that. So the data relates to those UK execs here. So yes, they tend to show moderate to high ambition. And remember, these are all average scores. So as soon as you've got sort of a bit above average in a sample this large, then that is worth mentioning. We wouldn't expect to be seeing averages at like the 90th percentile, so on. So on average, tend to be moderate to high on ambition. That's a high point. They tend to be reasonably cooperative, reasonably demonstrating the characteristics associated with being interpersonally sensitive. They're certainly more on the higher side. Thirdly, fairly open to new ideas, but not so high that they can't be pragmatic. And then finally, that low prudence point. For the UK, this is a notable point. We tend to be, on average, it seems a bit more flexible with rules and a bit more adaptable, a bit more comfortable with ambiguity. And in fact, that's the one significant difference between the UK exec sample and the global exec sample, is that we tend to be lower on prudence. So that's quite interesting. And when we look at this graphically, that's where you can see that big difference on the prudence. So the darker orange is the UK group, and the paler peach is the global exec sample. And in terms of the GLES, what did people in the UK say they wanted from their leaders? So the three things that came out here were 73% of respondents wanted them to show interpersonal sensitivity, to be diplomatic, to be tactful, warm, approachable. 63% wanted them to be more inquisitive, to have that strategic thinking piece, curious, imaginative, analytical piece, and 60% thought ambition was important, having that drive, energy, results focus, goal orientation. So those were the top three characteristics of Brightside that the UK respondents wanted. So matching up what we have with what we want, actually similar to the global findings. On the bright side, there tends to be a fair degree of overlap with the focus being on higher interpersonal sensitivity, higher inquisitive, and higher ambition being the characteristics that people seem to think are most important in terms of what they want from their leaders. And in fact, on average, the leaders do tend to demonstrate those characteristics. When we move to the dark side, then we find that UK executives tend to be moderate on excitable, and so they're kind of in the middle on that. And with the dark side, obviously, we're kind of more interested in more extreme scores, in the higher scores. With cautious, they're moderate to low. So the existing leaders we have are being fairly independent, able to voice opinions. They are, though, pretty high on leisurely. So there is a bit of passive aggression going on there. So I'll return to that in a moment. But we are a bit lower on bold, which is interesting given that at the global level, the global execs were higher on bold than followers wanted them to be. And this is picked out. This isn't part of the GLES. This isn't a characteristic that people were interested in, but it's mentioned anyway because it was a particular high point for the UK execs. It was their highest score was on HDS mischievous. So, but in terms of a significant difference compared to global execs, the UK leaders tended to score lower on bold. So that's a very interesting point. And then here you can see that high mischievous, so we're the darker red, the UK, that higher leisurely piece that I mentioned, and also the lower bold. So having a look then at, so what is it we actually want? Or rather what we don't want, sorry, because it's the dark side. This is so clear, 77% of respondents do not want their leaders to be high on excitable. And I think that is, I will have talked about this many, many times before, but there's research, for instance, when you look at derailers and their impact on how they are rated at work, and excitable is the one that tends to be rated the most negatively by everybody, whether it's your boss, your peers, your direct reports. Whereas bold, for instance, you might get a better rating from above than you do from below. But excitable, they're emotional, they show their emotions, they wear their heart on their sleeve. Everybody sees it when it spills out into the downside of being high on excitable. So yeah, 77% of respondents do not want their leaders to be high on excitable. 72% don't want them to be arrogant and entitled. They want them to be lower on bold. 60% do not want them to be leisurely and putting things to one side and not joining the team effort. And 58% don't want them to be cautious. So some overlaps there, obviously, with the global findings as well, but some particular UK-specific pieces there. So what we find then is that for the first three scales there, excitable, bold, and cautious, generally speaking, what we want is what we've got. We've got lower, we haven't got too many that are high on excitable. Actually, we do tend to be lower on bold, which is what people want, displaying a bit more humility, and lower on cautious. But for the UK sample, we have this mismatch piece where we tend to score, the execs anyway, tend to score higher on leisurely than their followers would ideally like them to score.
Out of curiosity, some of this is what their characteristics are, but then it doesn't talk about how they've learned to manage and actually behave in the real world, because they might have that derailer, but they might have learned to manage it well. So how could that play into what we want and what we see as well?
So I guess, I mean, that's for then when you're dealing with that individual. And when we come to the end of these results, we'll look at the kind of summary of, well, what is it that followers want, and think about, so how do we inform our leaders around the extent to which they may or may not need to adapt their behaviour. And then that is very much a conversation, for that individual in terms of whether they think they already have, or doing some 360 to find out whether other people think that they have. But it's just another, it's a piece of information for them to have a look at, to see, do they align or not? And if they don't, have they worked on it, or have they got some work to do?
This is part of the puzzle, not the...
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and my assumption is, I don't know if it's right, but my assumption is this is like the first stage in this research, and then hopefully this will be built on and could then be used in more practical applications. Yeah. And then in terms of values, scales that are picked out that are sort of more on the high or the low side here, or that relate to what people are interested in and want their leaders to show, would be that on average, we're kind of lower, sort of moderate to the lower side on hedonism, and with affiliation, again, actually moderate to low. So perhaps a preference for working alone, but with some teamwork in there. Altruism, we're kind of in the middle on that one. So balancing that social responsibility, care, concern for welfare of others with perhaps more organisational concerns. Low security, that's a particular notable point for the UK sample. We tend to, on average, score lower on security, so perhaps a bit more comfortable with taking risks. And aesthetics is in there because that's a sort of particular high point, although we just say moderate, but a sort of moderate almost to high. It's a particular high point for the UK sample. And then science, we're just moderate to low. So in terms of significant differences, though, between the UK execs and global execs on values, we tend to score lower on security, so more enjoyment of risk-taking and testing limits. And we also tend to score lower on affiliation in the UK for the exec sample compared to the global exec sample. I'm skipping ahead. So in terms of picking out those significant differences there, you can see where the dark blue, so much lower on security and lower on affiliation compared to the global sample of execs. And then in terms of the GLES survey, what did people actually want? Again, you're seeing much lower sort of congruence than you saw on the dark side and the bright side. So the highest rated value is only 40% of respondents agreed that this particular value was important to them. So again, that context point around values. But if we pick out the top 4, we've got the things that seem to be important to a lot of people in the UK is the values of affiliation, hedonism, science, and altruism. So quite an interesting mix there, in fact. Some much more social, some about thinking style and decision-making style. And this was something that a Hogan team picked out, was that because of those low, really they're kind of talking to those low responses, the congruence of responses, that UK respondents haven't picked out one particular single motivator as key for leader performance. But I don't think that's an issue. To me, that makes sense in terms of what actually happens in the real world. So matching what we want with what we've got. The one line that's that is a match is on altruism. We tend to want people in the UK, we want our leaders to be higher on altruism, and that is more or less what we've got. But all the others is a bit of a mismatch. So we score lower on hedonism than our followers would like, lower on science, and lower on affiliation. Competencies, the final piece here in the survey. So for the UK sample, in terms of the competencies that they tend to exhibit when you run their personality profiles through Configure, their top 5 are presenting to others, inspiring others, taking initiative, attracting talent, and competing with others. So again, a lot of those outward, impressing, emergent themes. Whereas in what we've got here in terms of what the UK respondents want, and then these are all items that are rated more than one standard deviation above the mean in terms of total responses for competencies and how they were rated. So UK respondents really want their leaders to demonstrate good communication, to be accountable, to have good decision-making style, have integrity, strong at leading others, strong at inspiring others, and demonstrating professionalism. So there is one overlap there, which is inspiring others. But all the rest, again, I think you can see are much more about getting on with the job, being that functional leader who's really leading the team and helping other people to do their job, and also setting a good example, being a good role model with the accountability piece.
There's a question.
Oh, yeah.
Presenting to others, isn't that kind of grounded in communication? Would you say that falls under that term?
Yeah, but presenting to others is there is a more kind of obviously the social presence, the impact, the standing up in front of others, whereas communication could be how you write something to somebody, how inclusive you are with your communication, how coherent. It's a bit more kind of basic, isn't the right word, but yeah. Whereas presenting to others is the much more outward facing, kind of putting on a show piece. Yeah. So what does this all mean? What can we do with this information? What does it mean? And I think one thing to say is this is the beginning of this research. And some of us who in our countries, if we had more than 200 people respond to the survey, then Hogan were able to put together data sets on this. So other countries are coming into that. People are still feeding into this research, and I expect that there'll be, more findings, more reanalysis, and so on. So obviously we'll keep you updated on that. But in terms of thinking about it, then what is the information we've got? And so Hogan would argue that asking people about their ideal leader then reveals important things about what they want their leaders to do, about how they want them to behave, how they want them to communicate and interact with them, how they want them to set strategy, how they want them to make decisions. So they would argue that it reveals who people want to lead them, what kind of people they want as leaders. And they also argue that people intuitively know what makes a good or bad leader. And then the extension of that in terms of leader development is to say, well, okay, so if a leader would actually listen and pay attention to what their followers want, if they know what it is their followers want, then they act upon it, then the notion is that they could then increase engagement with their people, they could be better placed to build high-performing teams, and also to retain those high-performing teams. And before I go into just the final summary, I just wanted to kind of state what is it we say in the UK is important. So in summary, we want our leaders to be interpersonally sensitive, to be curious, to have some drive. We don't want them to be too emotional. We don't want them to be too arrogant, and we don't want them to be passive aggressive, and we don't want them to be too worried about embarrassing themselves. And we would like them, though, to foster a sense of teamwork, to bring a sense of fun sometimes to work, to be logical and rational in their decision making, and to have some care and concern for the welfare of others. And then we also, these were the competencies that we just mentioned in terms of what people want. So kind of keeping that in mind, these are the things that we're saying people in the UK would like. So what Hogan did was to synthesize that information across the three instruments of the scales that were important and also the competencies that were important. And they brought out 3 themes that they think might be recommendations that we could use in terms of just generally leading UK teams. And I say generally because any conversation you have with a leader is going to have some context, and you will want to tweak it and amend it and make it relevant to them. But at that sort of general level, then one of the themes is around communication, and it's communicating with diplomacy and consistency. So bringing in the themes of wanting to be higher on interpersonal sensitivity, but also displaying integrity and accountability. So they have these 3 bullet points around, okay, so maybe we should be recommending to leaders in the UK that they take care to lead with tactful, respectful communication. That will help them to build trust. That they're very clear in how they articulate their goals and their decisions and follow through on that. And that also they demonstrate accountability by owning the outcomes, by acting transparently, even under pressure. The second theme that they brought out is from those aspects that we want our leaders to be higher on inquisitive and science, and also the decision-making competency being important. So it seems it's quite important to us that our leaders make strategic, data-driven, logical, rational decisions. So we might advise leaders to make sure they use evidence and analysis to guide their decisions, to stay ahead of challenges by applying strategic thinking, being aware of future trends, and though maintaining professionalism and ethical standards throughout the decision-making process. And then the final theme is it's all from the values piece. We want people to be, it looks like we want our leaders to value affiliation, hedonism and altruism. So this combines themes of building belonging and enjoyment at work. So these might be some elements that a leader could be advised to focus their attention on, to have initiatives to make sure they're fostering teamwork and a sense of shared success, that they make sure there are opportunities for collaboration and connection, that they find a way at least to promote a more positive and enjoyable environment that has some moments of fun, some moments of lightheartedness in there, and supporting initiatives that help the team to contribute to a greater purpose, to have some higher meaning, some other motivation for doing their work. So this was a synthesis of some recommendations that Hogan brought together from the results of the survey. But I guess for me, it does beg the question, and I have to actually commend Alex Schubert, our most recent recruit, who, when I was doing my run-through of this presentation, basically asked this question: is what we want what we need? We don't know. Is the short answer to that. We don't. So it's like the next piece of the research is, okay, so we know what we've got, we know what we want. If we get our leaders to try to move a bit closer to what we want, does that actually make them more effective? Does it increase engagement? Does it help them build higher performing teams? Does it help them retain those higher performing teams? And we don't know the answer to that yet. But my hope is that Hogan will then do the next stage of this research, because that clearly is the bit that's missing. But obviously we have to start somewhere. And some of this information, I think, is just interesting in informing ourselves around where there are differences between the UK and the global sample, both in terms of what we've got and what we want as well. Just having a look at those differences, because what you want to think about is, okay, so how are you going to use this research? I'm sure this is something that is front of mind for you. So, if we take those results from the UK and just apply them to the UK, you might be able to use some of that to help leaders, to encourage them to listen to what their followers want, and to point out, at the moment, this is what it looks like for the UK generally. Are there some areas here that you could develop towards, or that you need to develop towards, with the hope that that will have those positive outcomes around, obviously, being a more effective leader in terms of increasing engagement and building high-performing teams. But you could also use it to look at leaders across borders and look at, are there particular tweaks or adjustments that you need to make for people in different regions? What kind of level of data, what are the different comparison points that are sensible to make? Are there particular, if you're working with a global organisation, are there particular regions where you need to be thinking, well, for leaders in this region, their followers, this is the one that's more important for them? And I think at that point, what you might be looking at is more perhaps some of the significant differences for your region compared to the global sample. That could always be something. Whereas you, at a general level, if you're working with a global organisation, you're probably best placed just starting with the global findings, and then within a particular region looking at the significant differences. But those are some ideas of how you could apply that.